Today's video is another controversy video, but this one is a little bit different. It's a little bit more related to the business side of sports, but also fandom. And it did end up having a huge impact on business in other sports and other leagues in the years that followed as well. So stick around to find out how. But today I'm going to ramble about the Cleveland Browns relocation controversy of 1994 to 96 is kind of the timeline that we're looking at for this one. And in the comments, I want you to tell me, why don't you tell me who your favorite NFL team is? If it's the Colts or the Rams or the Steelers or the Bengals, your team might figure somewhere in this story. So first, a little background. This guy, Art Modell, he worked in advertising and in TV production in the 40s and 50s. Now, in 1960, Curly Morrison, who had been a running back for the Browns, was now in 1960 working as an ad exec for CBS. He told Art Modell that Dave Jones was looking to sell the Cleveland Browns. And Modell was interested, especially given his background working in television. He knew that the TV rights for what was at the time one of the NFL's most successful franchises could, get a lot of money, especially because at that time football was starting to compete with baseball as America's biggest sport. So in 1961, Art Modell is 36 years old, and he buys the Cleveland Browns for $4 million. Now, by today's standards, that's about $40 million. Still a great deal. But, the NFL wasn't what it is today in the 60s. It's important to note, though, that he only put in $250,000 of his own money. He ended up having to borrow $2.7 million, and then he found investors to cover the remaining million. That sort of purchase that relied really heavily on borrowed funds, that was almost unheard of. It's just bad practice. But Modell was approved by the NFL because the NFL was really trying to avoid any perception of instability in the league at the time. They were in competition with the American Football League, the AFL, and the NFL had especially already lost that market in Cleveland once before, when the Cleveland Rams went to LA, and the Browns arrived in Cleveland as an AAFC team. So essentially, the NFL was worried that if the Browns had to move out of Cleveland for financial reasons, to find a buyer elsewhere, that would leave room for the AFL to come in and establish a team in Cleveland and take that market. Right? The city can only sustain so many professional football teams, especially in 1960. Modell also promised never to move the Browns out of Cleveland, so that was a point in his favor as far as the NFL was concerned. So given that start, the way that he came about purchasing the Cleveland Browns, Modell spent most of his time as the owner of the Cleveland Browns in financial trouble. After he purchased the team, interest rates soared, which really hurt him since he had that big loan. And the cost of operating an NFL team went up very quickly as well. And add to that, a little bit later on in his tenure as Cleveland, as the Browns owner, that the Cleveland Indians moved out of the municipal stadium in 1994, and that really, really affected their revenue. The Browns, at that point, by 1994, they were sort of the de facto owners of the stadium. They technically rented it from Cleveland, from the city itself. But the way that agreement was arranged and that financial model basically made them the owners of the stadium until from 75 to 2000. And Modell got into some legal hot water as well during that time. At one point, he had bought a piece of land for just over $500,000, $625,000, in Strongsville to potentially build a stadium there. He then sold that land to Stadium Corporation. Now, Stadium Corporation was his company that he used to rent the municipal stadium from the city, from Cleveland. And so he sold that land that he bought for just over $500,000 to his company for over $3 million. And then in 1981, Modell sold the company's Stadium Corp to the Browns for $6 million. And that led Bob Grease, his family, owned 43% of the Browns. It led him to sue Modell. He argued that the sale of Stadium Corp to the Browns enriched Modell at the Browns' expense, and he wasn't wrong. So the case eventually went to the Ohio Supreme Court, and Grease won. Modell lost the case. So in 1986, Modell was ordered to reverse the sale of Stadium Corp to the Browns, and also to pay $1 million in legal fees to Bob Grease. And so this, put Modell in even more need of financial help. And he did find some help in Al Lerner. Al Lerner was sort of like a banking and real estate executive, and he bought half of Stadium Corp and 5% of the Browns in 1986. Remember that name. So On December 12th, 1994, Motel basically told his board that if there wasn't an injection of money soon, either for renovations to the current stadium or to build a new one, that he would have no choice but to move the Browns out of Cleveland. It's important to note that at the time there was going to be a referendum to raise the sin tax, right? So basically, sin tax is a tax on goods that are deemed harmful, so alcohol, cigarettes, etc. And the funds from that tax being raised would go to a stadium for the Cleveland Browns. But Modell, he didn't believe that the referendum would pass. So he told them, look, this referendum's not going to pass. I need money for a stadium, so I'm going to be stuck moving. There's no other way. Now, while that conversation was happening in Cleveland, over in Baltimore, the NFL, they told this guy, John Moog. John Moog was a new chairman for the Maryland Stadium Authority. The NFL told Moog that if Baltimore built a stadium, if you build it, they will come. If Baltimore built a stadium, they would get an NFL team, either an expansion team or a relocation team. Now, politicians in Baltimore, they were still feeling the pain from the Colts moving to Indianapolis after the 1983 season. So they refused to commit any financing to a new stadium unless Moog and the Stadium Authority secured a deal with a team first. So it was a sort of a catch-22 for Baltimore, because they needed a team and they needed a stadium, but they couldn't have one without the other. So, remember Al Lerner? He helped out Modell when he needed money. He was part owner of the Browns. He started encouraging Modell to move to Baltimore. So in July 1995, they met with Moog, and Moog promised or offered the Browns the rights to a brand new $220 million stadium. That's about $400 million today, if they moved the Browns to Baltimore. So on November 6th, 1995, the Browns are 4-5 on their season. They're coached by Bill Belichick. And Modell holds a press conference at Camden Yards, which is now Oriole Park in Baltimore. And he announces that he signed a deal to move the Browns to Baltimore for the 1996 season. Now, ironically, the very next day, November 7th, Cleveland voters approved raising the sin tax on that referendum to remodel Cleveland Stadium. So you sort of question the timing of Modell's announcement. It's almost as though he didn't care about the results of the referendum, and planned to move the Browns anyway. That's just my observation. So of course, despite the syntax going through, Modell refused to reverse his decision. He stated publicly that his relationship with Cleveland had been, destroyed beyond the point of no return. He said, "The bridge is down, burned, disappeared. There's not even a canoe there for me. So, I salute the drama." So immediately, the city of Cleveland sues Modell, the Browns, Stadium Corp, the Maryland Stadium Authority, and John Moog. And they sue them on the grounds of breaching the Browns' lease of Municipal Stadium, Cleveland Stadium. The lease required the Browns to play a certain amount of its home games there until, I think, 1998 or the year 2000. There are differing stories. So basically, the city filed an injunction to keep the Browns in Cleveland until at least 1998. A lot of other lawsuits were filed by, fans, season ticket holders, and in fact, the United States Congress heard, or rather held hearings about the issue. A protest was held in Pittsburgh when the Browns were playing there, and at the time it was like a great rivalry over there, but for the most part the Steelers fans supported the Browns and the protest because they felt that Modell was sort of robbing them of their rivalry with the Browns. So eventually, I should say, the fans started having signs and wearing clothes that said, I want to get this right, it said Muck Fodell. That's what it was, Muck Fodell. And almost all of the team sponsors, especially stadium sponsors, they pulled out because they didn't want any of the bad press. So it was kind of, talk about burning bridges. Modell was sort of burning any opportunity of this ending well. So eventually Cleveland accepted a settlement that would keep the Browns' legacy in Cleveland. So their colors, their logos, their history, their records, all of that would stay in Cleveland for a future franchise. For someone to basically come in and hopefully reactivate the Browns. And quite a few people were interested in acquiring the Browns or bringing, starting a team that's the Browns in Cleveland. But the NFL was requiring a new stadium for the Browns, for them to go forward, and the city didn't have any other stadiums that met the NFL requirements. So it was clear at that point that it would be impossible, even though there was interest, to operate the Browns the following year. So in February of 1996, the NFL announced that the Browns would be deactivated for 3 years. That a new stadium would be built for a new Browns team. and that either an expansion team or a relocation team would begin playing in Cleveland in 1999. It ended up being an expansion team, so to speak, because, the NFL didn't want to deal with more lawsuits of another team losing their identity if they were to move to take on the Browns' identity, colors, numbers, everything. And in exchange, Modell would be granted a new franchise in Baltimore, the Baltimore Ravens. Now, Modell was allowed to keep the contracts of the players and staff from his time in Cleveland, although notably Belichick was fired. And he was also ordered to pay Cleveland $9.3 million for the revenue that they would lose from those 3 years of not playing the Browns. And he was also ordered to pay the city's legal fees. So, as a result, the Baltimore Ravens are officially considered an expansion franchise, while the Browns are regarded as being suspended or inactive in the NFL from 1996 to 1998, even though the team pretty much up and left and went to Baltimore. And I'll end the story by saying this. In 1999, when the Browns came back to Cleveland, Al Lerner, who helped Modell to leave Cleveland for Baltimore, he was granted ownership of the Browns. So, a little bit of politics there, you have to admire. Al Lerner was kind of a background character in this, but you wonder how much of this was orchestrated by him or how much foresight he had, but pretty fun way to end the story. So, I mentioned earlier in the video that this whole scandal had an impact on other sports and other leagues. Well, for starters, for my Canadian viewers, the move to Baltimore and the whole Modell fiasco sort of indirectly led to the end of the CFL's expansion in America. The Grey Cup champions at the time were the Baltimore Stallions. But their owner, Jim Sparrows, he knew that he couldn't compete with an NFL team. And so he decided to go and reestablish the Montreal Alouettes, which ironically they are now the reigning Grey Cup champions. But elsewhere, the whole ordeal with Cleveland and Modell, it prompted other franchises and cities, actually mostly cities, to better protect themselves legally in the future. So, for example, the Minnesota Twins from the MLB, when they signed their deal with the city for Target Field, they agreed to a provision in the contract that allows Minnesota the right of first refusal if the team is ever to be sold. First refusal to buy. So essentially, if the Twins are going to leave Minnesota, Minnesota gets first look at buying the team. And it also requires that the name, colors, the World Series championships, the history of the team, they have to stay in Minnesota if the team ever moves out of state. So if the Twins go for sale, Minnesota choose not to buy them, they can move, but they can't take the history. The history stays in Minnesota for a future team. In the MLS, when the San Jose Earthquakes, when they were moving to Houston, it was announced by the league that while the players and staff would be moving to Houston, the team names, colors, logos, and trophies would stay in San Jose. And that team the Earthquakes, ended up coming back. In Ohio, there's actually a Model law that prohibits any sports teams that benefited from public facilities or financing from moving to another city without a 6-month notice. And even then, they have to attempt to sell the team to a local buyer first. So when the Columbus Crew, again from the MLS, when they started talking about a move to Austin, the Ohio Attorney General filed a lawsuit. And ironically, I think they're the current Cleveland Brown owners, Jimmy and Dee Haslam, along with other investors, they actually bought the Columbus Crew to keep the team local. In the NHL, after the Quebec Nordiques moved to Denver, again, the franchise's retired numbers, colors, logos, history, records, everything, they remained in Quebec City to be used by, future expansion franchise in Quebec. And I've got 1 minute to wrap this up. In the NBA, when the Detroit Pistons moved downtown to the Little Caesars Arena, their ownership group agreed that if the team was ever to move out of Detroit, everything, again, colors, records, history, logos, everything stays in Detroit. And again, this is an agreement that's worked in by the city when they invest in things like building new arenas, new stadiums, or investing in the team itself. The city is sort of protecting that investment. And that is the story and legacy of the Cleveland Browns relocation scandal of the mid-90s. Before my camera shuts off, thank you very much for sticking around and watching this video. Let me know which scandal I should cover next in the comments. And I'll see you tomorrow with another video.